Hey guys, welcome to another episode of On Air with Owen, and I'm joined today by the amazing Dale Dupree. He is the founder and CSO of the Sales Rebellion. He's been on a couple of our live events before, been following Dale for a number of years, absolutely love his content, so we're in for an exciting one today. First and foremost, Dale, how are you? Are you good?
Yeah, man, doing fantastic. I'm excited to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Great to have you on. What time of day are you there? You're pretty early, right?
Yeah, it's not too bad. It's
Oh,
7:30. I usually wake up around 5, so it's not that
nice.
bad.
Nice. Oh, you're well and truly warmed up. That's good to hear. Well,
Yeah.
look, looking forward to sharing some discussions with you today. And in a minute, I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes just to tell everybody your background, a bit about yourself, just really quickly, and then we'd like to get into topics. So our topic today is going to be sell more, suck less, which is one of Dale's taglines on his LinkedIn profile. I've heard him talk about this a bit. So how do you sell more? How do you stand out? How do you suck less and do what rubbish salespeople do far less? So we're going to be exploring that. Dale, for the people that haven't heard of you, and I guess a lot of people watching and listening will have, but for those who haven't, can you just give us a couple of minutes? Who's Dale? Who's the Sales Rebellion? Just let people know who you are.
We're happy to. I like to start my story back in 1984 when my father founded a copy machine sales firm. I was actually born a year later in 1985, and they say that toner was running through my veins. And even though I actually ended up going into the music world at 17 years old and touring in a band all over the United States and eventually landing on Warner Music Group, a major record label, I was called back to the copier world because of that intentional action that my father took so many years ago. Although I never at any point in my life was saying things like, I can't, Dad, I can't wait to work for you. Or, when the teacher asked in class, what do you want to be when you grow up? I wasn't like a copier salesperson. However, I liked the thought, and it was a very romantic thought of being in the family business to some capacity. Now, all of my family members actually also worked within the confines of the business, whether it was an internship when we were in high school or our first job at some point in our life when we had to make money. My dad was a provider for our family in regards to like the stepping stones of getting into business. Now, sales is where my dad put me when I ended up going and joining the company around the year 2007. And my music career, however, even though a lot of people would say, what could music help you with in regards to sales? It was actually my stepping stones, and that gave me a much better understanding of what sales was, because I was building community every single day. I was doing things like playing on stage in front of completely strange people in a strange and foreign city or state, and I didn't necessarily have any rapport or relationships with these folks, and had to like win their hearts over every night. And sometimes you were competing essentially against other bands for attention and to get someone to buy your merchandise so that you could make enough money to get to the next city. So it was a very competitive place as well too. And it when I got into sales, it was not that I suddenly was like, oh, I've already done this through music. It's just that I'd learned these lessons, from like walking around a crowded room with a backpack and introducing myself to random people. Hi, I'm playing in a band tonight. We're called Imperial from Orlando, Florida. I had some CDs, and I used back in the day, I had a CD player, if that doesn't age me. And so I would have one of our first EPs in the CD player, and I'd hand you headphones, and I'd show you our music. And then, if you were like, yeah, this is actually pretty good, I'd be like, cool, we're selling them for $5. How many can I get out of my backpack for you and get off my hands? And so I learned this identity again of what it is that we're doing as salespeople, causing curiosity, building community, a lot of different elements in the process, right? But the rebellion is actually born out of the principles and identity of who I was as the copier warrior. So in 2007, when I started selling copy machines, I spent about 2 years sucking. Which is why my motto works so well for me, because it's not as if I've never sucked at some point, right? And so I spent a couple of years just eating dirt. 30% of quota year one, 70% of quota year two. Year three, I started breaking every record in the book. And my dad had a 24-year-old company, 25-year-old company at this point. It was 29 years old before he sold it. And I was inherited by a new organization where 90 days in, I became the number one rep, and I never let go of the mantle in the 6.5 years that I was at the company. I eventually became a VP of sales. And what I realized, bro, is that I had something a little bit different than everybody else in regards to the sales landscape, that most people were transactionally selling the commodity called the copy machine. Not I. I was in full belief that I could change people's lives. And it wasn't smoke and mirrors either. I wasn't just telling myself that I was doing those things. I was influencing people through the perspective around what I was doing to help them. But ultimately, I was also getting to know these people quite well in the process and having an impact on their personal lives to some capacity, whether it was that I was donating to a charity that they knew very well, or that I was telling them stories about the way that my father interacted with me, and it was causing them to look at their relationships with their children differently. You know, there's lots of different, we can get into a whole rabbit hole around this, but ultimately the way that I earned that trust was very unique, in that most copy guys would walk in the front door, knock on it, make a phone call, send an email, and basically introduce their company and what they did. I would do things like drop off giant swords with like copier slayer, like, you know, written on the handle. And I would take cardboard cutouts of myself, like lifting said sword out of a golden copy machine in the middle of the woods. I dropped off crumpled up pieces of paper that said, "Hey, you throw away all the sales garbage you get anyway, so I pre-crumpled this letter to make it easier for you." I did all kinds of crazy marketing things, and that's what really elevated my career and allowed me to connect deeper with people. So that's me in a nutshell. 2019, I left a big a publicly traded corporation worth about $2 billion. I had got a good amount of experience from them and recognized that there's only one way to change the sales landscape, and that's to rebel. So I launched this company, and I'm coming up on 4 years next month.
Nice. Love that story. I absolutely love that story. The crumpled bit of paper is genius. I mean, that's, yeah, our tagline at R.E.A.S.O.N is be brave, sell more. And it's about, you know, can you be brave? Can you differentiate yourself? Can you do something that others aren't? And that's a perfect example of that. Absolutely brilliant. So it's interesting. You talked about that stepping stone through music, and I don't want to focus too much on the story to get here, because I really want people to learn from what you see working and not working in this. But I am interested in that stepping stone through music, because I guess that element of performance and being a performer really comes out. And I often talk about some of the greatest SDRs I've worked with have been people who are artistic, creative, they're actors, they're singers, they're musicians. They've got that ability to perform because, of course, you're in front of somebody in a sales meeting, on a phone call, whatever. You've got to be creative, you've got to stand out, and you've got to perform ultimately. And how much do you think that sort of that skill has served you well over your sales career?
It's a great point and question. And the big thing that you could always describe Dale as was creative. I had a big imagination. I dreamed very large as a child. And by the time that I was playing music, that creativity was able to be expressed, whether it was through my performance on stage or the lyrics that I wrote for my band. Because I was the singer, there was a lot of ultimately creative elements that were being infused that were my authentic self into what it is that we were doing. And so I also learned how to be very genuine. I was a terrible person. Like, candidly, I was a piece of shit at one point in my life. Especially at that point, I was struggling deeply with depression, and my way of coping with it was to be angry and to take that anger out on people and to make people feel lesser than me so I could feel better about myself. I eventually, I was able to see the light in those things, right? But ultimately, the whole journey, bro, was one of the most intense journeys that I've ever been on, because I had people coming up to me going, "Yo, your lyrics, I really relate to them, especially the ones that were about suicide and depression." And so I was able to have these deep conversation with kids, and then I would turn around and punch somebody in the face, 2 hours later in the middle of a mosh pit, and could care less, who you were, and I was better than you. And, I was a very arrogant person at that point in my life as well, too. So there was a conflict happening inside of me, and music really helped me to identify that and ultimately understand who I was better. I feel like I'm a very privileged person from the perspective of who my dad and my mother were and how they raised me, what I got to learn as lessons as a young man, and how I got to find myself very quickly and early in life so that I didn't ruin everything around me and have to make up for it, throughout the second half of my life. So for me, the journey was this identity of the person who I truly was. And because of that, when I sat in front of my first rejection at a receptionist's front desk at a medical facility, it was my first cold call ever, was at a medical facility, like, of all places, right? Like, private practice. Like, I mean, they don't like cold calls in medical facilities in general, right? Like, and here's my first one. Like, I remember walking out that front door, not really feeling hurt necessarily, but saying more to myself like, well, maybe they're kind of just like me. They're having a bad day. They're not really understanding their awareness as well as like I'm getting to the point of, and they don't really know that they're hurting my feelings by being so rude to me. And so I was able to really balance the things that were happening from that rejection standpoint. And so the performance went beyond like the creative side. It also was this idea of like really understanding your audience. If you looked out into the crowd, bro, I mean, I can still vividly remember some audiences where we played with like punk rock bands or we played with like pop punk bands and we were heavy metal. And I'd look out and I'd be like, these people, what are they doing here in some cases? Or this group over here is the people that came to see me, not this group over here. But I learned really quickly in my music career that don't do that. Like that's not appropriate. Then ultimately those people can become your family and friends as well too, the ones that you don't think can. So I always had this very open-minded, big heart. And really because of that, all I wanted to do was give people the best experience possible.
You know, I'm going to ask you a question. Just, I'm one of the things I'm seeing in just the way you talk and the way you come across that you talked about failing in your first couple of years of your career as a salesperson in copy, or 30% of quota and stuff like that. And in my experience, at least, anybody who gets to an elite version of what they do probably failed in the first instance, because you don't hit the ground, get something right, run for 2 years immediately and be elite. I think you practice, and you typically go through multiple iterations of failure on that journey. And so resilience comes in, and the ability to go and perform on a sales conversation, put yourself out there and do those, creative, wild things like cardboard cutouts and swords and all that kind of stuff. When you've had to deal with rejection, you've had to deal with failure, like that takes a certain mindset to keep going and doing that stuff when stuff hasn't worked, and when you've been through failure. What advice would you give to somebody who perhaps sees a dwindling level of confidence and performance through or off the back of failure? So they might get, they lose a big deal or whatever it is. And then I think you see most human psyche turns into suddenly they can only bring 70 or 80% of their game to the next sales meeting for a while. And it takes a little while to bounce back. And I feel like you're somebody that's managed to find an approach to that, or at least find a way around that and keep the confidence high and keep the performance high at every little touch point.
Yeah. So let's get deep here. I was bullied most of my life, and I played sports, and I was a big kid. I was like the dude that was 12 years old that was growing facial hair. I had to literally there was times I remember where it was, where's your birth certificate? Like that kind of thing. And some people would look at that as like, well, you were probably better than everybody else as well too. Well, I was really good for sure, and I was very competitive. I played competitively. I wanted to be the best. I wanted to go to college and play sports. I mean, that was part of like my whole upbringing. But bro, I was bullied by everybody. The shortest kid on the team, the tallest kid on the team, the chubbiest kid on the team, the skinniest kid on the team. I was like a punching bag for people basically. And I think a lot of that had to do with like my uniqueness. And here's the thing that I found though, is that I could go and play like organized sports and have a coach that would kind of keep things together ultimately, and like keep relationships pretty good. And then I could go out and play street ball. And when I would go out and play street ball, I realized that, and when I did that, like even if I got bullied in street ball, that like if I made my own way during those games, that I would be respected ultimately. And so I found that like really the environment, number one, is a huge piece. Like not everybody is going to be your customer because of the environments that they've built and how you fit into them. And secondly, I also realized that like when you do find your environment, you can win all day in your own way if you put your mind and your heart to it. But ultimately, I realized that I could kind of mesh those two thoughts together in the business world, because when you're selling a copy machine and everybody has a copy machine, it's more or less figuring out, again, like which type of court do I want to play on? Do I want to go after aerospace? Do I want to go after medical? And when I started to really hone into this identity for myself of where can I make the most traction for my career, cause the biggest headache for my competition, and create some waves ultimately for the industry. I found it pretty quickly because I was willing to put myself out there, and because I had been tormented my whole life, it didn't matter to me. You know, it's like, I can deal with this. I survived it. I lived through it. I'm here today. I can do this. And so I think an element of that as well too taught me that, you know, people call it thick skin. I just call it grace. You know, like that's what I call it. Like for me, it's just kind of surrendering to the fact that like you're not the best when it comes to somebody else's perception, and especially a person that just met you. They have no idea who you are. They're not just going to bow down to you or decide that you're great and amazing and take my money and here's, you know, sell me a copier. Like that's just not going to happen. So surrendering to that thought, and then just having grace with people like through the process, and recognizing too that like if you can just be patient with people and really work to earn those relationships, that ultimately you'll come out on top. So like my failures really, they're very important in my life, because ultimately they helped me. Like some people would say things like, you know, I got bullied and it made me, I went to the Marines and I became this elite person. And like me, I just felt bad for the people that were doing it to me at a certain point in my life, and felt really the need to like be an extension of grace for those folks. And that changes lives at the end of the day, because somebody did that for me. A lot of people did when I was struggling deeply with my depression as well too, and I had attempted suicide even, and I had told a few people in my circles, and I was afraid and worried even about telling some of these folks, but they did that for me. They extended that grace, and they met me where I was, and they were very compassionate. And ultimately there's still people that I think of today and that I credit to, you know, my progress and ultimately where I've come. And I've never paid them money, never given them anything of value ultimately. I mean, they probably tell you that I have, but that's not how I see it. I see it as, you know, the opposite. So again, I think this conversation can get extremely intricate and deep, but ultimately I think it's just about this concept of grace as sellers and patience as sellers. And then ultimately just like, look, if someone doesn't want to buy from you, it's okay. Like, that's not a problem. I used to tell my guys, I used to say, hey, in our territory, there's 68,000 businesses. So one says no, like, it's not a big deal. Like, either be patient with them or just move on to 559,999.
Yeah. So look, I'm going to get amazing. I honestly could listen to you talk all day. And particularly the story, and there's so much of me that wants to dig into the personal stuff, but I try and stay on like, how can our audience learn from you? How can they get like actionable tips, stuff that they're, and I think the bit I'd love to get from you is like, let's see if our listeners can identify themselves in this next part. What are the most common things that you see salespeople doing that suck? What are the things that you want to say to people, guys? Stop doing it. Stop doing this, or you know, or do less of that, or whatever it is. Give me the things that come to mind straight away.
So back in the day, this is where I start. Back in the day when I was selling copiers, the number one thing I saw is that everybody did it the same. And so if you're listening to this right now and you send an email sequence that you think is super dope, I guarantee you that someone else has the same email sequence. If you have some kind of cadence of cold calling on the phone, in person, whatever the case is, that you think is super dope, I guarantee you somebody has it as well too. Unless you're hearing me right now and you're going, I've done crazy stuff like Dale's talking about. I've sent stuff in the mail. I've given people experiences. And if that's the case, like, the question would be, are you nuancing that? Is that your entire existence as a salesperson and how you're helping people? And this is really where I go back to a great example, is that there was a guy very notorious in the copier world, especially in my industry, in my territories. And, you know, everybody hated him basically because he just raced to the bottom and won every deal, and he was in every deal, and God knows how he was. You know, I knew how he was. He was just doing what everybody else does. He was smashing the phones. He had a SDR on his team, and back in 2010, 2011, 2012, that was, SDRs were like, what's that? You know?
Yeah.
So it was kind of cutting edge, right, ultimately, but also he was doing it exactly the same as everybody else, right? But he was getting into these deals, racing to the bottom, winning on price. Well, I became the biggest thorn in this dude's side, because I said, all right, so all these people love him so much because he's so cheap. I'm going to give them something worthwhile to consider leaving him. And what I decided that would be the experience. And, you know, so imagine that a guy shows up to your office where you've bought copiers from this dude for 15, 20 years, and they hand you a little brick. And that little brick says, this is for the copy machine on it. And when you're holding that little brick, it's foam. And so you're like, oh, this is cool. Like I like this. And then there's with this little brick, there's a description, like literally a comic strip, and it shows in unison, like, or in the sequence, how to throw this brick at your coffee machine to fix it. And then there's a description that's like, wind up and chuck it as hard as you can. And then it basically says, this won't actually fix your copier, but it will emotionally heal you in the moment. And if you do want to fix it, give me a call, as opposed to this guy that's just banging the phone and saying, hey, can I meet and talk about your copier? Hey, can I meet and talk about your copier? And so even when that person is serving you for the last 15 years, this thing that you just did is so different than everybody else. And every single, what I realized, bro, and that I would tell everybody to think about, is that the people you're selling to are the people that could hire you. They're the people that ultimately they're building their businesses, even if they're just a C-level executive and they've only been there for a couple of years. Like, they are intricately entwined in the business in most cases. And when they look at the way that you interact with them, they think, is this somebody that I could hire, that I would want to work for me, right? That quality of thought is powerful, because I used to call in CEOs and people would say, why are you doing that? They're not the decision maker. They usually delegate the process for a copy machine down to an admin or somebody at IT. Well, I would tell them, I would say, because the CEO will respect my hustle more than anybody else. And the CEO will have never seen in his life or her lifetime what I'll do through my cold calling techniques and efforts. And because of that, it paid off. I had massive accounts, worth millions of dollars in revenue, and I got them all seamlessly and effortlessly, right? Like, to an extent, through this process of experiences. Because let me just tell y'all, like, it's a hustle for sure, and it's a grind, but it's fun to do this. And so especially when you start hearing from people as to like the type of experience you're giving them, you will be literally filled up by the words that they tell you. And even when people are like pissed off about something, I had a guy tell me one time, I'd dropped him off a crumpled letter, as we called them, and at the Rebellion, and he told me, yeah, this is the most like ignorant piece of marketing I've ever seen in my life. It's terrible. And I said, oh, well, you remembered who I was, though. And homie kind of waited a second, and he chuckled, and it's like, good point. And a couple of years later, I sold him copiers, right? So even when you spark a bad emotion in somebody, like becoming, or I should say, evolving away from indifference is what it's all about. Like, salespeople suck because they're indifferent. How the hell do you tell one apart from the other? It's like having quadruplets in your family. Like, the only person that gets it is the mom, right? And even sometimes the mom is like, hey, Max, and then Max stares at her and it's not Max, it's Matt, and Matt's like, Mom, I'm Matt, not sorry, like, that's it, right? Like, that's the perspective. We can't be lost in translation, and we can't be a part of the sea of sameness in the bullpen.
Love that. I love that. And I think, right at the top of that, that bit that you were talking there, you said about experience. And I feel like that is a really important word in this. You're giving them an experience. And that's what salespeople fail to do so much of the time. They give them a pattern that's, like you say, is indifferent. It's the same as everybody else. So guess what we get? We get behavior that's the same, which is no thanks, no thanks, no thanks, no thanks. Because we are conditioned to respond to salespeople in a protective, guarded way. And I'm guessing what you see from your approach is people open up, be human, be totally different. They give you something different that they wouldn't give to other people, which opens the door for you learning more, finding out more, building that connection with them that gets you over the line.
100%. I feel deeply that we as salespeople have ignored our place on this earth, which is that we are called. Sales is not easy. That's why we do it, right? Sales is challenging. That's why we do it. Sales is something that can change the world. That's why we do it. But people have gotten so hyper focused on the rewards, monetary or the physical things, right? The stuff, the big house, the fancy car. There's nothing wrong with these things, but we glorify them. We praise them. We worship them. They have become something in our life that drives us to continue to sell. And because of it, we do things like manipulate. We do things like tell a little white lie, or listen, like, sometimes we just don't give the information. And the reason we don't do it is because we might lose the sale. And to me, those things and that's incompetency ultimately, but like, it's also bad stewardship of our role as a salesperson, and it does not exude excellence. And so ultimately having this identity in mind of like what sales is turning into, with these weird influencers out there telling everybody to just get paid and make money, when ultimately, like, if I sell a process that can save somebody 30 minutes a day of time, I don't think people recognize just how intense 30 minutes of time is. I mean, you and I were just talking about this whole idea of like running a business and never taking enough time for yourself, and shutting down and walking away and turning off your phone. And because those are really important things that we cherish and we want to have. Like, if I can give somebody 30 minutes back in their day because I can help them to sell more and suck less, I can give them 30 minutes with their spouse, with their significant other, with their children, with themselves. I can help them to become more fulfilled and happier through the process.
Love that. I'm also picking up on a sense that you like people, you like people to smile and to have a bit of a laugh, and just like some of the stuff that's in the brick, it's humor, it gets people out of that pattern of normal, comfortable, I'm a buyer, I'm being sold to, and you're not going to get in me. And I think the moment you make people smile or laugh, they open up, don't they? You get a totally different version of them, and it feels like that's important to the strategy as well.
For sure. I think us as humans, we don't think about connection enough, and that humor is like a conduit around connection. That even if the person doesn't laugh out loud and keel over dying, I mean, the fact that you made them smile internally even is a huge piece of the puzzle. People would prefer to do that. People sit around in a monotonous cubicle from 8 to 5 all day and literally do the definition of insanity, right? The same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And so, like, giving people something to laugh about and enjoy, like, humor is a powerful tool. And it doesn't have to be Chris Rock humor. It doesn't have to be some underground guy or girl that y'all are thinking about. It doesn't have to be some weird YouTube video or TikTok. Like, humor can literally just be through this process of connecting people to the process of what you fix in a more humorous way. So instead of telling somebody like, hey, I can help you with the downtime on your copy machine, I hand them this brick and I say, hey, this is the copier fixer, the magic repair brick. And suddenly people, they can relate to that. They go, God, yeah, you get it, bro. Like, because these things break all the time and there's really nothing we can do about it at the end of the day. Instead of me trying to pretend as if somehow buying from me, you're never going to have a problem. Right.
Yeah,
so being very human and relatable, I think, is what humor is all about.
How does an individual sales rep start this journey? So imagine I'm listening to this and I'm identifying with same sequence, same pattern. My email just looks the same as everyone else. My phone, my cold call scripting looks exactly the same as everybody else. I'm just saying the same thing. I'm making 120 calls a day and I'm saying the same thing, getting the same result. I've identified that's me, and I'm sitting there thinking, right, I want to start this. How would they go about that? What would be your advice? How do they start? And secondly, how do you play that in terms of brand, internal brand? Because I'm guessing that as an individual within your dad's business, there's an argument to say you probably had a bit of creative freedom. You could probably get away with a bit more, or maybe you just bullied your way to it and said, no, I'm doing this, get out of my way, I'm doing it. But within some organizations, it might be quite hard to sort of get out of the pattern. It might be the culture that this is how it's done. We've got to work within this framework. And I'm just trying to think in real terms, how would I go about instigating and starting this journey?
Funny, because I started when I was doing my creative stuff with my dad. It was in 2010. And it was really small stuff. It wasn't anything crazy. Sometimes it was just going to the dollar store and buying a Matchbox car for like the tire company. I was about to go cold call and like having a message with it. And like I said, at first it was very simple. It was with the company that bought us. Matter of fact, there was a couple times that I thought they were gonna like ask me, like suspend me, like from making cold calls. Like it felt like mass amounts of pressure, even sometimes, because suddenly I'm representing this other group and they don't know me very well, but they couldn't deny my numbers, and so they just kind of left me alone ultimately in the process. But in the beginning, there was stress for sure. There was a couple times my mentor and a man that changed my life, Rich Johnson, who was my boss, he'd tell you, he'd be like, yeah, Dale got pretty upset a couple times over us telling him that he couldn't do something, or like warning him about something because people were in the office were unhappy with the way I was doing, whatever the case. Like, I forgive those people and I'm not really worried about it these days, but in the moment it can pressure you to stop.
Yeah.
Right. I say dare mighty things. And in the middle of risk, like, you're going to have pressure put on you and you're going to have people unhappy about what you're doing. But if it's the right thing, keep doing it. But what I would tell reps is, like, look, you got to start somewhere. So just start with the basics. Like, even if you're just sending a video message where you're doing something like the dude from Gong recently that had a post blow up because he got an appointment with some guy, trying to do 10 minutes of planks, which was a relatable thing to this dude because that was his challenge. The challenge of this guy, he's a fitness guy. He's telling people to do 10 minutes of planks kind of thing. And right, like, he just shoots a video of him trying to plank for 10 minutes, and every minute he gives the dude a reason why he should use Gong. And like, to me, like, that's very simple, right? But that speaks directly to somebody. It's creative, it's fun. It is literally 999% different than the majority, every single, I should say, call that this person has gotten from a sales rep up until that point. And like, we have literally heard people say, we send this thing called the unwritten story. Some rebels do it too as well, but we do it mostly internally. We send a book, it's got blank pages. I'm not going to say anything else. As you check out my content, you can see some great examples of it. But we have had people come back to us and say, this is the best marketing and copy I've ever seen in my life. I don't even know what you do. Let's set an appointment. Even though, like, at some point in that copy, it tells them what we do. It's almost like people just see what they want to see at the end of the day. And that's what you have to be thinking about, is that you might be calling to change this person's life, but they don't know that until you give them the right kind of experience that differentiates from what they're used to experiencing.
And, I think the planned out version of this is great. So the marketing campaign, the get the attention, the plank, you're creative, you do it. How much of it is then about backing that up when you get that meeting? Because I'm guessing a lot of people could do that bit where they can be creative, then they go to a meeting and they maybe feel a little more under pressure. We're all nervous. They got to be, they got to be maybe a bit more in performance mode. Or is it okay that gets you the meeting and then you can fall back into a bit more of a pattern that might be a bit more normal, let's say, or does it just break it because it's inconsistent?
That's a great question, bro. A lot of people don't ask this question, and this is part of our teaching. We have a theory called the reason theory, and it's an acronym, and the N in reason stands for nuanced. And the whole thought of it is even that, like, within the cold call, you have to nuance, within, setting the appointment, you have to nuance but it also, like, builds into the discovery call. It builds into qualifying. It builds into the close negotiations. Like, if at some point you are not this thing anymore, you will fall victim to the status quo. Now, people still fall victim to the status quo, no matter what, right? And that's really the challenge. Like, I remember it took me 2.5 years to get through a bid that I was doing all kinds of crazy stuff throughout the process, like little checkpoints, as we like to call them, where somebody got an experience, whether it was in person, whether it was just in the mail, whether they even had anything coming up within the RFP that they needed communication from, like, they got stuff from us. And at the end of that 2.5 years, I mean, this guy told me, this is the most experiential sales process we've ever been through. Like, none of us disagree that you're the best salesperson, but we decided to stay with the guys that we currently have because it's just easier. And look, like, some people would say that's a win, and like, I would agree that it's a win too, but like, it's a win because it helped you to understand that, like, it's going to take 4 more years for you to actually win this. Like, that's the actual win. The actual win is that you now have the ability to be able to really test your own patience and your own abilities to be able to be who it is that you desire to be and sharpen that sword. And in the meantime, like, this attitude of abundance is extremely important as well inside of this whole process. And that we don't just do cold calls really crazy, like the Rebel Way says, in order to set an appointment and then slam somebody home, right? We do it in abundance with that kind of mindset and attitude to lots of people, knowing that even when we get to the end of most sales, we're probably going to lose. And when we take that perspective, it creates a more realistic outcome for ourselves. We have to worry less about the component of self-doubt and complacency, even in that self-doubt. And instead that we choose legendary in that process, and we become something much different. So I love the question. And I simply, after that long explanation, would say it's very important to be the rebel from start to finish and nuance the process of, experiences and what you're doing for somebody throughout the sales cycle.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting book, because I can see people doing something creative behind the comfort of a screen on LinkedIn to get themselves a meeting, then turning up to a meeting and being bland. And I can see that just being totally inconsistent and going, well, it's a bit disappointing. So I'm glad you said that. Final question. I feel like I'd ask you about another 20 questions, but I'm going to stick to one. And I guess there'll be people listening to this that'll be thinking, who does this work with? So what personas does this work best with? And are there personas where maybe it's a bit too edgy, maybe you get the wrong reaction? I think you touched on that there, where somebody said, oh, this is the wrong kind of approach. Are there maybe more reserved personas where this would work less well, and others where it works extremely well?
What I would say to that is that everybody deserves your best. And the best is to give experiences at the end of the day. Now, let me give you like a varying degree of rebellion here. So in our Rebel Letter campaign, we've got 4 letters that are, part of the package. Essentially, there's the coffee stain letters, the pre-burnt letter, there's the traveling letters, the crumpled letter. And based on the things that I've told you earlier, you can probably figure out the theme of each of them. If I hand somebody a letter that looks like it's been burned up, and I tell them like, hey, no worries about this sales and marketing, you can use it as kindling to roast some marshmallows and eat some wieners with your family around the campfire tonight. It's funny, and it causes people to again, like, be lighthearted. But ultimately that works really well with like a blue collar person, and not necessarily hits home the same way with HR at a tech firm, right? However, stereotyping people like that is dangerous. And what we tell people is, it's like no risk, no reward, and you need a relationship. So like, you call that HR person and she's like, yeah, you could have just called them hot dogs in the letter. And also like the whole like lighting on fire thing, I actually like called the cops and had them investigate this letter. I'm going to tell you all right now that we've had rebels, like I've gone through this, and we've had rebels go through this as well too, where like an entire building gets like literally vacated and they bring in a hazmat team over a letter. That company will 100% buy something from you. They will never forget you. Also, and most of them feel pretty stupid afterwards, when they go through the front, they're just like, wow, it's just a marketing piece. Like, so it's interesting, right? Because there can be risk. It's very minimal. The thousands of letters that I've sent, and the 1 or 2 times, like tens of thousands, and the 1 or 2 times that something like that's happened has been crazy. But what I had found in the 10,000 letters is this, is that sometimes you could take that crumpled letter and you can ball it up in your hand and hand it right to the first person that you meet. Other times you want to put that letter in an envelope that doesn't have that feeling of trash on it, and maybe just has an image that has this effect of crumpled paper, or a big red stamp on it that says crumpled letter inside. And maybe sometimes, you don't even crumple your letter. You just, again, print the texture through a digital image on your letter and tri-fold it up. So there are ways to still convey fun and the experience to people where it meets them where they are just the same. So again, there's a lot of variations of the experience at the end of the day, but no matter what, give everybody an experience.
Love that. Dale, amazing listening to you. And it just makes me think, like, allow my creativity to go off and probably get a bit dangerous on the things that you could do. But I hope that our watchers and listeners and have got their creative juices flowing as well, and they're out thinking about what they can do to go and open the door with prospects. Can I just get you to give you the opportunity at the end of this, just to say, who does the Sales Rebellion help? Who should be talking to you, and how can they get in touch?
Sure, I appreciate that, Owen. The Sales Rebellion helps all those who seek to serve, and ultimately the folks that we're looking for in our tribe are those that are looking to elevate their sales experience. To sell more and suck less means to become a better person, more so than to become a better salesperson. So those that are looking at their life and saying, man, it's a little monotonous these days, or I feel like I'm living that definition of insanity that Dale talked about, or I'm pretty successful, but there's something missing in my life. I feel a little lonely. I feel a little bit like on an island at times. Like, that's what we're here to do, is to help people to understand that there's a whole movement and community behind this identity of what sales truly is and how it can change the world. And so for those that dream big, we're here for you. And for those that seek to dream big as well too, we're here for you just the same. But a lot of the things that we do from the perspective of our services is that we coach and train sales teams, run SKOs, do workshops, the normal stuff. But I think the big thing that the people love to hear is that these campaigns that I talked about, we build them for people, right? So we build these campaigns out from a sales perspective, and then allow marketing teams, essentially to do their thing and create inbound, through this process. This isn't just an outbound theory for folks as well too. So it's just one of those pieces of the puzzle that we have to complement, the existing relationship between sales and marketing at the end of the day, and make marketers look better just the same too, right? So if anybody is interested in getting a hold of us, the best way to check us out and learn more is salesrebellion.com. But y'all can find me on all the social platforms. It's either at Dale Rebel Leader, at Sales Rebellion, or on LinkedIn, /IN/Copier Warrior.
Copier Warrior, love it. Dale, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. I'd love to get you back on and keep talking about this topic in the future as well. It's absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Appreciate you, Owen.